Hello everybody, my name is Adrian Anderson and I am back again for episode 2 of the BOREAS documentary. Today we will be exploring what has the animals turned into since we last saw them. Well, an interesting fact, because Boreas' atmosphere was basically finished before complex life started evolving, such as multicellular organisms, land is basically ready for the Boreas organisms. And so because of this, we will be exploring the freshwater ecosystems and the eventual landfall that comes with it. Let's explore the invasion of land. Now let's not forget the million-year span that it takes. The continents will drift over time, and we need to see what they would look like. Let's take a look at the Boreas continents after a million years. As you can see, they're drifting towards each other, turning into some sort of supercontinent of sorts, similar to Pangea, but they'll eventually split again in a couple million years. But right now, they're about to turn. Now with the Curriculum Testa, their descendants would actually go far more shallow, often being at beaches and evolving a sort of amphibian-like lifestyle. The Titarius would feed on very small plants into the ocean, often ripping them up from the ground and then swallowing them whole. This would cause a leech-like mouth to form, and they would actually crush their plant matter within their mouth, before digesting it inside their stomach. Their saliva would still be used to dissolve plant matter, but it wouldn't be as effective as before due to not needing to dissolve it completely for a soup. They also evolved pattern-like dark spots in order to absorb a little more heat, as darker colors absorb more light and therefore more heat. They would still rely mostly on blubber in order to stay warm, and these dark spots only slightly aid them in the warmth. They also evolved an anal hole, or a cloaca, and also use it as a reproductive organ. They've also developed very unnoticeable sensitive eyes, which can detect light. Because of this, this will become the eventual eyes of the Boreas animals. You know how I said that it's impossible to swim in the Boreas oceans? Well, I may have sort of lied. Well, kind of. Only some parts of the seasons Boreas creatures can really swim. So Grunschneckes may evolve into a seasonal organism called the meerbats. They would evolve their legs into be more like fins in a way, often swimming through the shallow seas and oftentimes the very deepest parts of the ocean. And deeper than what the Grunschneckes previously lived in, by the way. The meerbats would often mate and then reproduce, and the females would lay eggs which would stay still. But some of these meerbats would actually separate and go into the rivers of the Boreas oceans, and instead become freshwater organisms. Now let's see what they have evolved to. The meerbats would evolve into 3 clades. One of them would be called sharks of the rivers, which are a spear-like organism that have adapted a segmented shell. This would help them go in a moving side-to-side type of motion. This will eventually cause a dorsal fin, but for now they won't have it due to this segmented shell still needing time to develop. They would also grow a tail fin and more webbed features rather than the usual limbed fin. They were fast carnivorous predators that would stab their prey and suck the juices out of them, and they would often do this with a variety of creatures. They have also successfully developed fully fledged eyes, with an pupil of sorts. This will eventually carry on to their descendants and their relatives. The Equus feminis, on the other hand, would evolve to be more of a slow-moving defensive organism, often evolving their shell to also be on their proboscis, while also being segmented. They would mostly feed on plant matter, stabbing their little proboscis into it in order to feed on the sap. Though one of their clades would decide maybe land is a little bit more interesting. Here we have the Fluminus slatus, cleaner of the rivers. These are scavenger-like organisms that would feed on dead animals and dead plants, and they would often evolve more of a lamprey-like mouth to scrape off organisms' flesh and then feed on it. Well, you know how they all have proboscises and this one doesn't? Well, yeah, that causes a bit of a problem. You see, when many plants die and many animals die, that releases ammonia in the water. And so these creatures can help reduce that said ammonia by eating up that flesh. This will cause less of a dirtiness into the water and make it more clean instead of being very dirty and filthy. Eventually, they will clean up the rivers, And maybe some of these guys would explore the ocean once more, cleaning up the oceans as well. But for now, they're you may be concerned with their big gills flopping around and their small shell. Well, the thing is, these organisms are very small, basically the same size as before, but even smaller. Because of this, they actually also evolved a poison-like flesh like monarch butterflies, and because of this, most predators wouldn't even dare to eat this. Even ones that can handle poison, they don't taste that good, and they aren't worth it. Now the Mesosaur is quite a unique one. It's one of the first creatures to actually be adapted for land. Now it isn't fully land-like, it's more of an amphibian. It has really strong legs though that allow it to go on land. But it mostly sticks in the water, as it still has gills, not spiracles. They use their trunk-like organ in order to pull down plants, or take off leaves in order to throw them into the water, and then start drinking the juices inside of them. They have stalk eyes in order to see what's outside of the water, so they can pull them down and get the right plants. They're the first ones to actually have stalk eyes, and this will be a trait in some of their descendants. Now let's take a look at the plants before we even get to the land creatures, because every land needs plants. Some of the Dracoherbas will evolve into tree-like organisms, known as the Robuster Balm. The Robuster Balm has a ton of leaves now at the top, becoming sort of like a pine tree in a way. They are very big and gigantic, and way more gigantic than previously. They're about the size of your average tree. Quote-unquote bark, but it's more like exoskeletons as it is made out of chitin. The Deja Arbor would take the tree aspect even farther, evolving their arms to hold leaves, and I mean a ton of leaves. These would grow into something that would look a lot similar to what trees on Earth would look like, but more symmetrical in a way, and keeping their gonads spore releasers, as they still need to reproduce. The Sexfolium Arbor is a smaller variant, opting to stay smaller in order to not consume as much energy. They have about 6 leaves which are attached to tiny arms. So, instead of having about 2 arms, they now have about 6. The freshwater aswams would end up turning into a semi-aquatic plant species called the Floss Shamanist, which translates to flower man, because of their flower-like appearance. This will go on for many generations, and they would be the first asymmetrical groups to appear, or at least the first asymmetrical plant life to appear. Well, never mind, forget it. They would eventually diversify into a multitude of organisms, though. They would end up turning into the Custos of BOREAS, also known as the Guardian Tree, which would end up protecting a certain type of animal, but we'll find out what it is. Now look at the top. Notice something? There's no gametes. Now look below the leaves and above the roots. Those are where the gametes have moved. They've come closer to the ground so that creatures can drink the liquid inside of it, similar to nectar, because that's where the spores are. The spores swim around in the nectar in order to thrive. And when a creature comes along and drinks that up, some of the spores will attach to the mouth. Then the creature will find another plant, drink that nectar, and then soon, those spores that were latched on will drop inside of there, and the spores will fertilize each other. Then another creature walks in, drinks that nectar up, and then they do their daily tasks, and those fertilized spores will drop off, and then they'll grow into a guardian tree. That is how their life cycle works. And one of these creatures it protects, well, they're about to give it a very, very nice life cycle, creating one of the best symbiotic relationships. But for now, let's look at another one. Another creature, also known as the Pentatarbor, has evolved a unique way of reproduction. While still keeping the traditional way of releasing spores and having them fertilize the gametes, they would actually evolve a different way of spreading them. They'll then stack all of them inside of a little fruit-like thing and fill it up with liquids too. This way it could drop off and creatures could slurp it up, and creatures could spread it around so that the spores that were missed can still reproduce, or at least have a chance at it. Here we have the Primaterra, which translates to first land. There's not much unique about this organism other than the fact it's the first land organism to ever appear. So those old plants we talked about, well, it's not really chronological order. They appeared after this plant appeared, but that doesn't matter. Here we have the Hasterradix. Well, it's evolved into a land organism as well, turning into the herba, also known as a strong plant. This is due to how it's a more grass-like organism, and therefore it'll have to become stronger and more durable, so that when it's crushed, it isn't that bad. It still has a normal way of reproduction, however, not much unique. Here we have the serpens herba. This plant-like organism has evolved into being a vine-like thing, often growing on trees and then wrapping around them in order to suck in their juices. One of these organisms would eventually just forget about the whole plant thing and become a parasitic insect equivalent. These creatures will diversify in a bit, but right now, they're just parasitic. Remember how I said one of the Equus flaminius had changed paths? Well, one of them had turned into a semi-aquatic organism, and eventually, just an avian organism. These gliding organisms would eventually turn their gills into a spherical, and then those little antennae they would normally have, to feathers, a nice coat that keeps them warm. They would eventually use a combination of said feathers and a blubber in order to keep themselves warm. So they were actually the most cozy organism on BOREAS. They would glide from tree to tree, often searching for food, like the said Insectum herba, and the nectars that the guardian trees produce, and the fruits that the hang trees have. They would end up forming symbiotic bonds with said trees, and they would end up becoming very nice partners, as the Cachalavis would have a nice place to stay at and stay safe in, and they would also help the trees reproduce. Unlike birds, however, they didn't really fly, they mostly glided. Their wings aren't too powerful enough to keep them off the ground for long, and they didn't really care for their young. They just laid their eggs under a tree and left. Now some of these mesors would eventually turn into land organisms. Meet the heron limax. The heron limax would eventually adapt their trunk to be a beak-like mouth, often spearing into the water and then taking whatever fish-like organism out of the ground, and unless it's the said cleaners of the rivers, which are poisonous, they'll often rip their innards out in order to be eaten by the heron limax. If they're not ripping their prey apart, they'll actually just swallow them whole. But what about the shells? Well, what they do with the shells is that they would actually use it to slowly but surely form a little nice exoskeleton for them. They would also use it to help their shell out and make it more stronger, but they would mostly use it to strengthen their skeletal system. This will eventually become a fully fledged skeletal system, and not just be a little weird bone thing inside of them that they can bend around. The heron limaxes would also become lighter in color, so that prey won't see them easily, because lighter skin is less noticeable, at least to fish. Now we have the awl snapper, also known as the bone snapper. This organism is an ambush predator that often hunts the heron limax, and they have a very gruesome way of killing too. Unlike their name, they don't really snap bones, but rather, they snap the bones and then try to rip all the innards out of the heron limax. The heron limaxes are their main prey, but they can feed on the fish occasionally. They'll often rip them apart to ensure they're dead and they won't run away, often ripping all their limbs off first, and then starting to eat them. This is a very gruesome way of eating, but this is just to ensure total death so that they don't end up running away even though their legs are torn off. So it's better to stay safe than sorry. They would become white in color in order to camouflage with the snow, so that is a very interesting feat on them. Speaking of feet, the awl snappers have hooves. This is because of the snow. It's better to have a flat surface so you don't get your feet frozen than to have a stabby surface in order to get your feet frozen, and also your legs. Now that is all for episode 2 of BOREAS. I hope you guys enjoyed it, because I certainly had a decently enjoyable time making this. I'll see you next time that I have enough time to work on this series, as, you know, I'm a kid, so I have school. Yes, laugh at me, but anyway, see ya.